Imagine a city. Normally, its streets are crowded, its markets loud, and its squares echo with laughter and arguments. But now, only the whisper of the wind moves through the stone alleys. Windows are shut, doors hide in unspoken fear. Even the sound of breathing feels like a threat. This silence is not the work of nature. It is a mark of one of humanity's deepest fears, epidemic disease. Throughout history, plagues have paralyzed not only bodies, but also the very soul of cities and the fabric of societies. A virus, a bacterium, an invisible microbe has brought empires to their knees, changed the course of wars, challenged faith, and sometimes shattered humanity's trust in itself and its gods. The devastating force of epidemics is found not only in death tolls, but also in the way people look at one another, with suspicion, with fear, with distance. Neighbors fear neighbors. Parents hesitate to embrace their children. When disease spread, the foundations of daily life cracked apart. Bakeries stood empty. Schools were closed. Church bells tolled only for funerals. People lived torn between helplessness and guilt. Some rebelled against the gods. Others believed they were being punished for their sins. A few imagined they carried in their own hands a cure that could save an entire city. Yet no matter the response, epidemics always revealed the same truth: the fragile and fleeting nature of human power against the vastness of nature. Silent City is therefore not just a name. It is a symbol of the eerie, unsettling quiet that follows every outbreak. For in every era, in every land, and in every society, epidemics transformed humanity's crowds into silence, its confidence into fear, its order into chaos. And this story is the story of those silent cities. When we think of human history, what often comes to mind are wars, vast empires, magnificent palaces, victories, and discoveries. Yet behind these grand narratives lies another history, often hidden from view, silent, invisible, and as devastating as armies. Disease. This unseen enemy has walked alongside humanity since the earliest days of civilization, from the invention of the wheel to the birth of writing, from the founding of the first cities to the rise of great civilizations. Every step humans took was shadowed by its presence. As humans sought to conquer nature, nature struck back with an invisible weapon. Epidemics, contagious diseases, slow-consuming inflammations, and fevers that could claim lives overnight. Early humans were vulnerable. They could craft stone tools, control fire, and hunt animals. But against microbes, they were powerless. Skeletons from eras before writing bear silent testimony to this invisible war. Some bones show the deformities left by polio, others a slow erosion of syphilis, and some bear joints shattered by leprosy. These marks prove that humanity's struggle with nature was not limited to predators, cold, or famine. It extended to invisible enemies. And this enemy could bring even the strongest warrior to his knees in an instant. Disease transformed not just individuals, but communities. In small hunter-gatherer groups, illnesses were usually limited because populations were sparse and people constantly moved. Yet with the dawn of agriculture, the rise of villages and cities created fertile ground for disease to spread. People now lived in crowded spaces, shared the same water, breathed the same air, and lived closer to animals. Tuberculosis passed from cattle, smallpox from sheep, influenza from pigs, plague from rodents. The agricultural revolution thus brought not only food surplus and civilization, but also the birth of epidemics. One of humanity's greatest turning points also marked one of its most vulnerable moments. Yet in those days, no one knew about microbes. To make sense of disease, people turned to faith, myths, and supernatural forces. When someone ran a fever, it was believed spirits had possessed their body. When a village was struck by an outbreak, it was seen as the wrath of the gods. Disease was regarded as a supernatural punishment or an invisible curse. People sought healing from witches, shamans, and priests. Prayers were said, sacrifices offered, incense burned. Sometimes a healer cured with herbal remedies. Sometimes a patient was left helpless, surrendered to fate. Disease was the sternest teacher, revealing the limits of human knowledge and power. Thus, the history of disease is not only the history of medicine, it is also the history of humanity's search for meaning. Even if early humans did not understand why they fell ill, they noticed that illness disrupted order and demanded a price. This awareness shaped both religious rituals and social norms. At times, epidemics scattered tribes. At other times, they brought societies closer together. When a plague struck a village, people prayed together, mourned together, and tried to rise together. Disease became a force that tested not only the body, but also social bonds. In this earliest stage of history, diseases whispered a fundamental truth to humanity. You are powerless against nature, fragile in body, helpless in spirit. Humans must always live on guard against invisible enemies. And this truth would later echo through the tablets of Mesopotamia, the papyri of Egypt, and the writings of Greek historians, heralding the great epidemics that history would record. Mesopotamia, home to some of the first great civilizations in human history. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians recorded humanity's struggle against nature and fate. Yet among the many threats these civilizations feared, one of the most dreaded was invisible yet deadly: disease. For the people of Mesopotamia, illness was not merely a bodily ailment. It was a sign of divine wrath, the invasion of evil spirits, or the touch of a cursed spell. Clay tablets and cuneiform inscriptions describe the causes of disease in terms like evil wind entering the body, a dark spirit taking hold of a person, or the touch of a demonic being. These explanations reflected their worldview. To comprehend the invisible, they turned to the supernatural. When a person fell ill, it was not just their problem, it was the problem of the entire community. The sick were seen as victims of divine anger, and thus the process of healing was as much a spiritual and religious ritual as it was physical. Mesopotamian society had asapu, priest healers who served simultaneously as doctors, magicians, and mediators between gods and humans. Confronted with disease, the first step was to appease the gods. The patient would be purified with water, sacred texts recited, and prayers offered. Then sacrifices were made, sometimes small offerings of food, sometimes animals. These ceremonies symbolized human helplessness, and the gaze turned toward the heavens in search of mercy. Because the true causes of disease were unknown, Mesopotamians sought remedies through multiple channels simultaneously. Alongside prayers and magic, they used plants from nature as medicine. Ointments were made from various herbs and applied to wounds, while some plants were boiled and ingested. Yet the efficacy of these treatments was often uncertain. Ultimately, their hope lay in the mercy of the gods. Recovery was interpreted less as the result of a remedy and more as the end of divine punishment. In Mesopotamian belief, some illnesses were directly associated with specific gods. For example, the wrath of Nana, the moon god, was linked to epilepsy, while the anger of Shamash, the sun god, was believed to manifest as eye diseases. Disease was a divine message, a warning of human sin, societal transgressions, or a king's injustice. Thus, illness was not only a bodily affliction, but also a societal crisis. When a plague swept through villages, it was seen as a sign of the gods' anger toward the entire community. This worldview permeated daily life. When people saw someone sick, they maintained a cautious distance, yet approached with sacred touch, participated in sacrificial ceremonies, and prayed together. Disease was both a source of fear and a force for solidarity. In the face of helplessness, people clung to one another, collectively awaiting the mercy of the gods. Though these beliefs may seem strange to us today, they reflect humanity's earliest encounters with the unknown. In an age without modern science, microscopes, bacteria, or viruses, the Mesopotamians entrusted this invisible enemy, beyond their comprehension, to the hands of the gods. For them, illness was a direct message from the heavens, and recovery was a sign of reconciliation with the divine. The legacy of Mesopotamia teaches us this. Diseases shaped not only bodies, but also cultures and belief systems. From the earliest cities onward, Humans sought not only cures, but also meaning in the face of illness. And this quest has never truly ended in human history. The civilization of Egypt, like Mesopotamia, interpreted disease both as a physical ailment and within a divine framework. The regular floods of Nile, while bringing agricultural abundance, also created conditions for the spread of illness. As cities and temples grew crowded, contagious diseases spread rapidly. The Egyptians understood disease as connected to the gods. For instance, it was believed that illnesses were manifestations of the wrath of Sekhmet, the goddess of disease. Sacred texts and papyri recorded fevers, eye inflammations, and digestive disorders, and sought to restore balance through ritual. Medical practice was a fusion of prayer, healing techniques, and magic. Patients were spoken over with prayers, treated with herbal remedies, and sometimes subjected to spiritual cleansing using amulets and charms. In ancient Greece, disease began to be observed in a more systematic way. The plague of Athens, circa 430 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, shook the city profoundly. The historian Thucydides' detailed accounts reveal not only the death toll, but also the psychological and social impacts on the population. Under the guidance of Hippocrates, the Greeks proposed that diseases could arise from natural and environmental conditions. Illnesses were no longer seen solely as the wrath of the gods, but were increasingly examined for observable causes. This approach planted the earliest sparks of scientific medicine. Thus, humanity, within these early great civilizations, began both to seek explanations for disease and to develop methods to cope with it. The prayers of Mesopotamia, the rituals of Egypt, and the observations of Greece illustrate that throughout history, epidemics were not merely health problems. They shaped society's beliefs, social structures, and collective knowledge. With the emergence of humanity's first great cities, disease was no longer just a problem for villages and small communities. There were now empires, vast societies spread across extensive lands, connected by roads, ports, markets, and fortresses. These empires inspired all with their power and wealth, yet the same roads, ports, and fortresses became the most efficient carriers for an invisible enemy: epidemic diseases. The Persians, ruling a vast empire from Mesopotamia to India, faced their first serious encounters with epidemics. During military campaigns, diseases carried from city to city weakened armies, left borders vulnerable, and sapped the morale of the population. Yet the Persians did not respond to disease with fear alone. They attempted systematic measures. Quarantine-like practices, keeping sick soldiers outside the camps, and the purification of sacred spaces were applied as both religious and practical precautions. Still, microbes, invisible and ruthless, continued to strike relentlessly. In the Roman Empire, the impact of disease threatened not just individuals, but the operation of the entire state. Roman roads, aqueducts, and ports represented both the empire's strength and its most fragile points. Epidemics spread rapidly along these routes, drastically reducing the population of cities and towns. The Antonine Plague, 165 to 180 CE, severely weakened the Roman army. Cities emptied, fields went untilled, trade stalled, and the number of soldiers protecting the empire's borders decreased. Historians report that deaths were so numerous that new burial grounds had to be established. Funerals formed queues, the dead were buried in mass graves, and the air in cities was heavy with the presence of death. In the Byzantine Empire, the effect of epidemics were once again profoundly felt. During the reign of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, the Great Plague, known as the Justinian Plague, erupted, affecting not just individuals but the very state itself. The bustling streets of Constantinople fell silent. Ports emptied, markets spoiled, and tax collection became nearly impossible. Daily life ground to a halt, and people were forced to live under the shadow of death. Even the emperor's administrative centers were not spared, as advisors and high officials succumbed one by one. The Justinian Plague demonstrated that diseases were not merely biological phenomena, but forces capable of shaping politics, the economy, and social order. Trade routes closed, armies were depleted, and cities faced economic collapse. Yet people did not experience this catastrophe solely as pain and loss. It also marked the beginning of societal and cultural transformation. The church and the state developed new methods to maintain control, hope, and order. Rituals, prayers, and public ceremonies became tools to manage the chaos created by the plague. The roads, ports, and fortresses of empires became carriers of disease, while this invisible enemy forced humanity to recognize the importance of organization, solidarity, and precaution. Every epidemic was measured not only by death tolls, but also by the resilience, knowledge, and crisis management of societies. As people realized that disease threatened not just the body, but the state itself, they began to develop both medical and administrative measures. Quarantine, border control, sanitation practices, and health regulations began to emerge during this period. Epidemics were also a warning to empires. No matter how powerful you are always vulnerable in the face of nature and microbes. Cities, ports, and fortresses were not just symbols of strength. They were pathways to the circulation of disease. Humanity observed, recorded, and shared these experiences across centuries to better understand this cycle. This is why Empires and the Messengers of Death is not just a historical chapter. It is a story of humanity confronting an invisible enemy with both fear and resilience. Epidemics cross borders, shake societies, and rattle empires. But they also teach a lesson. Without knowledge, preparation, and solidarity, no power is ever truly safe. In the mid-14th century, Europe witnessed one of the darkest and most devastating catastrophes in human history. The Black Death. Its very name inspired fear, for this was no ordinary loss. It was the work of an invisible, relentless, and inevitable enemy. Death wandered through the cobblestone streets of cities with the wind, and silence reigned in villages. People feared leaving their homes, the places they considered safe, and even communal rituals came to a halt. Modern research indicates that the source of the Black Death lay in the large rodent populations of inland Asia and the fleas that parasitize them. These fleas carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitting it to humans. The disease spread rapidly via the Silk Road and trade routes. Port cities became the gateways for the epidemic's entry into Europe. Bustling trade hubs like Sicily, Genoa, Marseille, and Venice were the doors through which invisible death entered. Ships docking at the ports carried not only spices and cloth, but also death itself. The symptoms of the disease were horrific. In the early days, high fever, chills, and headaches appeared, followed by large swellings in the neck, armpits, and groin. These were the buboes, the inflammation of lymph nodes. Purple, black, and blue lesions appeared on the skin. Sometimes the whole body swelled, and within days, a person either succumbed or miraculously survived. The rapid lethality of the disease caused panic and despair among the populace. Society's response was complex. Feudal peasants could not leave their fields. City dwellers could not conduct their businesses. Markets lay empty, and people waited in silent terror. Funerals were massed, cemeteries became insufficient, and the number of dead spiraled out of control. In some cities, hastily dug mass graves created horrifying scenes that still shock modern archaeologists. The church called on the people to pray to appease God's wrath. Rituals became frequent. Priests prayed day and night, and incense was burned in sacred spaces to repel the plague. Yet prayers often proved inadequate against the silent screams of mortality. Driven by fear and desperation, people began to accuse innocent neighbors. Jewish communities alleged witches and other sinful groups were blamed for plague, resulting in lynchings and persecution. This fear deeply shook both the psychological and social fabric of society. The economic impact of the Black Death was equally devastating. The labor force was drastically reduced. Peasants had to demand higher wages due to the declining population. Landowners could not cultivate their fields, while peasants sought security for their livelihoods. Europe's economy faltered. Food production decreased, and trade routes were disrupted. The collapse of the feudal system, the reshaping of labor relations, and the emergence of new economic arrangements began during this period. Cultural and artistic effects were profound as well. The danse macabre, or dance of death, symbolized that death was the ultimate equalizer for all humans. Painters and sculptors depicted the inevitability of death in their works, reflecting both fear and fragility of life. Writers conveyed the chaos, helplessness, and social transformations caused by the plague in diaries and letters. People had to learn to live in a world where the presence of death was constant. The Black Death also challenged the authority of the church. Questions arose among the populace. Why did God not prevent such catastrophe? Some communities interpreted the plague as divine punishment, while others, recognizing the church's inefficacy, sought alternative religious or mystical explanations. The epidemic simultaneously fueled both faith and reason-based approaches to understanding and coping with the disaster. Scientific observation began to emerge during the outbreak. Some physicians attempted to identify that the disease spread directly through the air or via fleas. The Black Death became medicine's first major test, not only to treat disease but also to understand and organize societies. Quarantine measures, the isolation of ships at certain ports, and the safe burial of the dead were among the first systematic interventions applied during this period. The imprint of the Black Death on human memory was deep and enduring. Silent streets, empty markets, grieving families, mass graves, all revealed the wounds inflicted on social and cultural structures, far beyond the immediate physical toll. Europe experienced not only the loss of life, but also the transformation of social, economic, and cultural systems during this era. Ultimately, the Black Death stands as one of the darkest catastrophes in human history, not only as a numerical loss, but also as a societal and cultural turning point. An invisible enemy shook communities, emptied cities, altered economic systems, and transformed humanity's worldview. Though tragic, the Black Death also revealed human resilience, societal adaptability, and capacity to learn in the face of crisis. By the late 15th century, as ships crossed the Atlantic from Europe to the New World, humanity was not merely discovering new lands, gold, and spices. These vessels were carrying an invisible passenger as well: diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and other infectious diseases would claim the lives of millions of indigenous people overnight and completely transform societies. This catastrophe was not only a demographic disaster, but also marked the beginning of a period in which cultural, economic, and political orders were shaken. Columbus's landing in America in 1492 was more than a geographic discovery. It marked the start of a biological catastrophe. The Columbian exchange transported plants, animals, and cultural elements, but also European microbes, to the New World. For the first time in human history, the indigenous populations of a continent encountered pathogens unknown to their natural immune systems. These microbes, harmless to populations in Europe who had developed immunity, became a deadly threat to the native peoples. Smallpox was the most devastating epidemic of the period. The disease manifested with purple and red rashes, high fever, vomiting, chills, and severe pain, often leading to death within days. Measles and influenza spread similarly, dramatically reducing the populations of native societies. In some regions, up to 90% of the population perished within a few years. Historians note that the Aztec Empire's population was reduced nearly by half due to epidemics following the arrival of Spanish conquerors. The epidemics destroyed not only bodies, but also cultures. Indigenous leaders, warriors, and priests died one by one. Ceremonies were canceled, rituals could not be performed, and knowledge could not be passed between generations. Cities emptied. Once thriving metropolises like Tenochtitlan, with their bustling markets, temples, and palaces, fell into silence. Fields lay fallow, food shortages emerged, and economic systems collapsed. European conquerors exploited these depopulated lands and populations to establish colonial systems. Epidemics thus became not only disasters, but also catalysts for historical shifts in power. The psychological impact of the epidemics was profound. Indigenous people could not understand the cause of disease, and often sought solutions in supernatural forces. Some interpreted it as divine punishment. Others attempted to counter it through rituals and shamanic practices. Yet, these efforts proved ineffective against microbes. People were left helpless, and the moral and psychological fabric of society was deeply shaken. lost families, loved ones, and leaders created a collective trauma. Europe's intervention unfolded in a different dimension. Conquerors and colonizers viewed epidemics as both obstacles and opportunities. Immune to many diseases, Europeans took advantage of the dramatic depopulation of native communities to seize lands, expand the slave trade, and build colonial cities. Diseases became the invisible allies of Europe's colonization policies. Epidemics functioned as biological weapons, altering intercontinental power dynamics. The impact of the Columbian Exchange extended beyond human health. European animals, new plants, and agricultural techniques transformed local ecosystems, while imported pathogens affected biodiversity. Tuberculosis, influenza, and other infections impacted not only humans, but also local animal populations, leaving long-term ecological effects. This demonstrated that diseases were not merely a medical issue, but an ecological and societal crisis as well. Epidemics transformed the New World, not only physically, but culturally. Languages disappeared, rituals were forgotten, and historical memory was erased. Yet this catastrophe also served as a warning for the development of epidemiology and medical knowledge in Europe. Humanity once again learned that microbes knew no borders and had global consequences. The biological contact between Europe and the New World became one of the earliest and most destructive examples of globalization. In short, the discovery of the New World was not only a geographic and economic achievement, it was also the beginning of a period in which diseases, infectious microbes, and invisible enemies entered the historical stage with force. Epidemics fragmented societies, shook cultures, disrupted economic and political systems, and shaped humanity's capacity to resist, learn, and adapt in the face of crisis. The New World had become not only a land to be explored, but also a stage for microbes, epidemiology, and global interaction. Humanity now faced its first truly global epidemic experience. The scale of the catastrophe was measured not only in numbers and deaths, but also in the collapse of cultures, the reshaping of societies, and the questioning of humanity itself. Epidemics have become a global force, determining the course of history and transforming both Europe and the New World forever. The 16th century was a period profoundly shaken by epidemics across Europe and the world. This century, marked by the opening of major trade routes and the acceleration of urbanization, facilitated the rapid spread of contagious diseases. Plague, smallpox, typhus, and similar epidemics erupted intermittently in European cities, paralyzing urban life and claiming significant portions of the population. Epidemics affected more than just mortality rates. They deeply influenced social structures. Labor shortages disrupted agriculture and production. Many villages were abandoned, and towns were plunged into economic stagnation. Epidemics increased the bargaining power of workers and peasants, while the aristocracy and guilds had to devise new strategies to secure labor. In this way, epidemics became events that not only created health crises, but also transformed social power dynamics. Cultural and religious life was also profoundly affected by the epidemics. Confronted with the inevitability of death, people sought both fear and solace. Religious ceremonies, processions, and communal prayers strengthened social solidarity under the shadow of death. Meanwhile, art and literature emerged as essential tools for reflecting on the impact of epidemics. Tragic paintings, death motifs, dramatic poetry, and religious works demonstrated people's attempts to make sense of loss. Through art, humanity confronted fear, while imbuing death with meaning. The 16th century epidemics also influenced the history of science and medicine. Physicians began to observe the spread of epidemics, record the symptoms of diseases, and develop methods of protection. These efforts laid the foundations of modern epidemiology and public health. Although knowledge was limited, societies gained experience and developed preventive measures for the future. Epidemics also tested political power. Decisions taken during crises determined leaders' credibility and authority over the public. Leaders who failed in managing epidemics faced public backlash, while those who succeeded gained respect. This highlighted the fragility of political stability and social order. The epidemics of the 16th century left more than loss and suffering. They fostered social solidarity, cultural creativity, and scientific curiosity. Under the shadow of contagion, people learned not only to survive, but also to strengthen societal and cultural bonds. This century remains a time for which modern society can draw lessons regarding health, economics, and social structures. The 17th and 18th centuries stand out as a period in human history when science achieved its first concrete victories against epidemic diseases. Europe, Asia, and even North Africa had long struggled with smallpox and other infectious diseases, once seen as divine wrath. These illnesses threatened not only individuals, but also the very foundations of societies, their economies, and social structures. Humanity no longer sought answers in fate or divine punishment. Observation, experimentation, and reason became the path forward. Smallpox was among the most feared diseases in 17th century Europe and Asia. High fever, vomiting, skin pustules, bruising, and often death struck children and young people hardest. Epidemics paralyzed communities, emptied villages, silenced city markets, and halted economic activities. For millennia, humans had interpreted disease as the intervention of supernatural forces, turning to witches, priests, and shamans. But now, in Europe and Ottoman lands, a proactive approach to disease was emerging: variolation. Variolation involved deliberately exposing healthy individuals to a mild form of smallpox. Typically, this was done using material from the pustules or fluids of someone who had already survived the disease. Initially practiced in China and the Ottoman Empire, it was observed to provide safe and effective immunity. By the early 18th century, this method began spreading in Europe. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, an English aristocrat living in Istanbul, introduced variolation to England by having the procedure performed on her own son. Society initially reacted with great skepticism. People feared deliberately contracting the disease might be seen as defiance of God, yet experience proved otherwise. Children who underwent variolation often contracted only a mild illness and survived. This marked one of humanity's first bridges between traditional belief and scientific practice. By the late 18th century, English physician Edward Jenner developed a method to further reduce the risks of variolation. Jenner observed that women working with cows who had contracted cowpox became immune to smallpox. In 1796, he applied cowpox material to a young boy who subsequently gained immunity to smallpox. This simple but revolutionary method laid the foundation of the modern vaccine and became a turning point in medical history. Jenner's approach was both safe and effective, and rapidly spread throughout England and Europe. Scientific innovations were not always easily accepted by society. Fear and prejudice against vaccination were widespread, especially in rural areas and among less educated communities. People sometimes perceive vaccines as mystical experiments or attempts to challenge God, and religious authorities occasionally oppose vaccination on faith-based grounds. Nevertheless, doctors and scientists work tirelessly to educate the public, promote vaccination, and prevent epidemics. Vaccination campaigns became both a medical and social struggle. Variolation and Jenner's vaccination method did more than provide individual immunity. They heralded social change. Humanity began to understand that diseases were not inevitable destiny, but could be controlled with preventive measures. Immunity became not only an individual responsibility, but also a societal duty. Vaccination campaigns organized in towns and cities laid the groundwork for modern public health institutions and inspired governments to take responsibility for the health of their citizens. This period also intertwined scientific methods with ethical questions, deliberately exposing people to disease, balancing risk with societal benefit, and ensuring public safety while experimenting. All presented technical and ethical challenges. Variolation and vaccination demonstrated that humans could intervene effectively in nature, but also highlighted the importance of responsibility, ethics, and social cooperation. These experiences shaped the ethical foundations of modern medicine. During the Enlightenment, science became not just a technical tool in combating epidemics, but also a symbol of hope and resilience. Humanity learned to confront disasters through observation and reason, rather than submitting to divine will or the whims of fate. Laboratory work, microbiology, antisepsis, and hygiene practices were tangible outcomes of this scientific revolution. People no longer relied solely on prayer. They began to resist epidemics with knowledge and experience. Variolation and vaccination showed that humanity could act with knowledge in the face of the unknown and fear, creating a collective response to crisis. Epidemics became opportunities not only for survival, but also for learning and development. Modern medicine began to take shape during this period, marking humanity's first steps toward emerging from the Dark Ages through knowledge and experimentation. Thus, the 17th and 18th centuries became the era when humanity won its first scientific victories against epidemics. Variolation and vaccination saved lives and demonstrated that humans could wield effective power over nature and invisible enemies. This period symbolized both a medical and cultural awakening, a transition from darkness to enlightenment. The birth of science is remembered as a history of humanity's capacity to resist, learn, and adapt in the face of fear and the unknown. Fighting epidemics was no longer merely a physical struggle, but a victory achievable through reason, observation, and collective effort. At the beginning of the 19th century, Europe and North America were undergoing one of the fastest social and economic transformations in history. Factory chimneys rose to the sky, coal smoke blanketed cities in a gray haze, and rivers were polluted with industrial waste. The transition from the calm rhythm of agricultural life to the crowded, noisy, and intense industrial cities fundamentally changed human life. This rapid transformation was not only economic and social, it also profoundly affected the nature and speed of disease spread. Cities had become not only the centers of human life, but also hubs for microbes. Cholera was one of the most feared diseases of the 19th century. Originating in India, this deadly disease traveled to Europe through trade routes and ports. Once it reached the city, cholera spread rapidly in overcrowded, underdeveloped working-class neighborhoods. Its severity was ruthless. Severe diarrhea, vomiting, muscle cramps, and rapid dehydration often led to death within days. People struggled to understand its cause, attributing it variously to foul odors, divine punishment, or mysterious curses. City infrastructure was inadequate to cope with the rapidly growing population and industrial pressures. Sewers were often open channels. Streets were littered with waste, and access to clean water was limited. These conditions made disease spread almost inevitable. Each cholera outbreak caused not only individual deaths, but also social panic, economic collapse, and political instability. Factories lost workers, trade halted, and neighborhoods were quarantined. People lived in fear and uncertainty, unable even to trust their neighbors. During this period, modern science began to play a crucial role in combating epidemics. English physician John Snow laid the foundations of modern epidemiology through careful observation of cholera outbreaks. In London, the 1854 cholera outbreak in the Soho district sparked widespread panic. Snow meticulously examined death records and mapped the spatial distribution of cases. His observations revealed that the disease spread through contaminated water, not air. The Broad Street pump, identified as the outbreak's epicenter, was shut down and the epidemic subsided. This event demonstrated not only the transmission mechanism of cholera, but also the power of scientific observation, data analysis, and evidence-based intervention. The Industrial Revolution and rapid urbanization transformed epidemics from mere biological events into triggers of social, economic, and political crises. Cities began to be organized with public health in mind. Municipalities and governments were forced to redesign sewer systems, provide clean water, improve waste management, and enhance living conditions in poor neighborhoods. These measures laid the groundwork for modern public health institutions and prompted states to recognize their responsibility for societal health. Epidemics also highlighted social inequalities. Wealthy districts with wider streets, better infrastructure, and access to clean water were less affected by disease. Poor working-class neighborhoods, crowded and unsanitary, remained constantly vulnerable. Cholera and other epidemics revealed the deep connection between health and social justice. shaping the societal dimension of public health reforms and urban planning. Industrialization and urbanization brought both progress and vulnerability. Factories, trains, and ports symbolized economic growth, but they also created dense environments where microbes could spread rapidly. Epidemics exposed the fragility of human life amid industrial and urban development. Yet, through scientific methods, observation, and data analysis, humanity no longer had to rely solely on fate. John Snow's work paved the way for modern epidemiology and public health movements. Cities became not only centers of human activity, but also systems managed through scientific observation, public health measures, and social cooperation. Laboratory research, microbiology, and hygiene practices emerged as tangible indicators of scientific progress during this period. While epidemics continued to instill fear, they also encouraged scientists to develop innovative solutions. People no longer relied solely on prayer. Knowledge, observation, and collaboration became tools to resist disasters. Epidemics evolved from being sources of death and fear to opportunities for learning, adaptation, and progress. The 19th century is remembered as the era when modern public health, epidemiology, and urban planning were born. The Industrial Revolution exposed humanity to new diseases, but also demonstrated that disasters could be overcome through knowledge, observation, and collective intelligence. Cities have become not merely spaces, but stages of the complex interplay of science, society, and life. Humanity learned to resist deadly epidemics in the light of modern science. By the mid-19th century, humanity had begun to realize that diseases were not merely a matter of fate or divine punishment. Yet the causes of illness remained mysterious. Cities were growing. Industrialization and dense populations accelerated the spread of disease, and death silently filled the streets. While people looked helplessly at deadly epidemics, some scientists pursued this invisible enemy. It was during this period that modern microbiology was born, giving humanity a completely new dimension in its battle against epidemics. Louis Pasteur was one of the pioneers of these revolutionary discoveries. Working in his Paris laboratory, Pasteur carefully observed events that seemed ordinary at first glance. Spoilage in wine and beer production and changes in fermentation processes played a critical role in his understanding of microbes. By examining microorganisms under the microscope that caused spoilage, he made the invisible visible. He demonstrated that spoilage was not a spontaneous phenomenon, but the result of living microorganisms. This discovery laid the first stones in the history of microbiology. Pasteur's work was not limited to food safety. Experiments on small animals and demonstrations of microbes' disease-causing capabilities challenged the basic assumptions of medicine. His laboratory, filled with microscopes and culture tubes, became the arena for humanity's first true confrontation with invisible enemies. Pasteur's work on rabies further cemented his place in history. By developing a rabies vaccine, he not only saved lives, but also showcased the power of the scientific method. Humanity realized that it could confront invisible microbes not with fear and helplessness, but with knowledge and experimentation. At the same time, Robert Koch was creating a similar revolution in his laboratory in Germany. Koch developed systematic methods in microbiology, conducting meticulous experiments to prove that specific diseases were caused by specific microbes. By isolating the tuberculosis bacterium, he scientifically demonstrated that diseases had definite causes. Koch's postulates became a cornerstone of modern medicine. Diseases were no longer random or fated, but the product of particular microorganisms. The work of Pasteur and Koch not only revolutionized the understanding of disease, but also shaped laboratory culture. Scientists began to record experiments meticulously, making results verifiable and reproducible. Medicine transformed from a field of trial and error to a systematic and reliable science. Laboratories became sacred spaces where humanity fought its invisible enemies. Microscopes, culture tubes, and sterile experiments represented a new battlefield. During this period, aseptic and antiseptic practices dramatically reduced surgical mortality. Joseph Lister, by using sterile techniques during operations, began protecting patients from infections. Surgeries, once nearly always fatal, became safer. Thanks to germ theory, doctors and surgeons could protect themselves and their patients, marking one of the most radical transformations in medical history. The discoveries of Pasteur and Koch were not only a scientific revolution, they also transformed society's perception of disease. Epidemics were no longer merely supernatural forces. They were understandable and preventable phenomena. This understanding reshaped public health policies, urban planning, and hygiene standards. Laboratory discoveries enabled states to assume responsibility for providing clean water, managing waste, and controlling infectious diseases. Epidemics became associated not only with fear and panic, but also with the importance of knowledge and collective societal action. By the late 19th century, the foundations of antibiotics were being laid. Penicillin had not yet been discovered, but the idea that bacteria could be controlled was taking shape through microbiology and laboratory work. Humanity was no longer a helpless observer. It had become an active agent, observing, understanding, and intervening. This marked the birth of modern medicine and humanity's first victories against invisible enemies. The fear, helplessness, and death caused by epidemics throughout history were replaced with knowledge, methodology, and confidence, thanks to the work of Pasteur, Koch, and their contemporaries. Humanity learned to confront invisible enemies and achieve life-saving victories through the tiny organisms under the microscope. The age of microbes was not only about understanding disease. It symbolized humanity's revival through science and victory through laboratory work and observation. Epidemics were no longer solely about death and loss. They became struggles to be faced, learned from, and ultimately overcome through collective human intelligence. The year 1918 witnessed one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. While the devastating shadow of World War I still loomed over Europe and many parts of the world, a virus rapidly spread across continents. Humanity faced a new catastrophe alongside the horrors of war: the Spanish flu. Although it came to be called the Spanish flu because Spain's newspapers reported it first, independent wartime censorship. The pandemic in reality affected people across America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. The virus was particularly notable for its high mortality among young adults. Unlike typical flu outbreaks, which primarily threatened the elderly and children, the 1918 pandemic reversed this pattern. Healthy, young individuals fell ill quickly, and their bodies deteriorated in a matter of days. People faced fever, coughing, chest pain, extreme fatigue, and sometimes vomiting blood. The body seemed to wage a war on itself, with the immune system overreacting, causing many deaths within days. The war was one of the biggest factors accelerating the virus's spread. Thousands of soldiers lived in close quarters on the front lines, and mobile units carried the virus across continents. Trains, ships, and wartime logistics networks facilitated rapid transmission. Cities, with their dense populations of workers and soldiers, became highly vulnerable. People worried not only for their own lives, but also for the health of loved ones. Streets emptied, schools closed, workplaces halted production, and the rhythm of society nearly came to a standstill. Medical knowledge at the time was limited. While microbiology had been shaped by the works of Pasteur and Koch, the nature of the influenza virus was still unknown. Antibiotics did not exist as they targeted bacteria, whereas viruses were an entirely different enemy. Doctors and nurses struggled with limited knowledge, often helplessly observing patients. Yet healthcare workers displayed extraordinary dedication, remaining at the forefront of both physical and psychological battles against the pandemic. The social impacts of the outbreak were devastating. Fear and uncertainty spread across all levels of society. People kept their distance from one another, and even neighbors' visits were seen as risky. Funerals were conducted rapidly, and mourning rituals were restricted. Newspapers reported the situation with official figures, but rumors and panic-driven stories circulated quickly among the public. Social life, economic activity, and daily routines were almost completely paralyzed. Governments struggled to manage the crisis. Health infrastructures, already strained by the war, were overwhelmed. Hospitals were full and doctors and nurses were in short supply. Quarantine measures were implemented in cities, public gatherings banned, and schools closed. Yet international coordination was lacking, making it nearly impossible to halt the spread. Governments attempted to develop both scientific and social strategies to protect public health and manage the panic. The economic impact of the pandemic was equally catastrophic. Labor shortages reduced production and disrupted supply chains. Food production and distribution were interrupted. People faced threats not only from disease, but also from hunger and poverty. The flu further weakened economies already strained by war and highlighted social inequalities. However, the Spanish flu was not only destructive, but also instructive. The pandemic provided lessons for modern epidemiology, public health policies, and international health cooperation. People understood how global mobility and wartime conditions accelerate disease transmission, the vital importance of infrastructure and hygiene, and how societies must prepare for health crises. Its psychological and cultural effects were profound as well. Art, literature, and media process a pandemic, embedding it in collective memory. Diaries, letters, and memoirs documented both personal and societal impacts, becoming instructive sources for future generations. The Spanish flu represented one of modern humanity's greatest health tests. It emerged as both a biological and social crisis. People faced an invisible enemy in addition to the devastation of war. Streets filled with death, fear, and helplessness, while humanity sought ways to overcome the catastrophe through science and cooperation. The pandemic symbolized not only a disaster, but also the birth of modern public health and epidemiology. Humanity, amidst death and despair, learned its first lessons in resilience through observation and science. The 20th century was both an era of hope and struggle for humanity. While wars, economic crises, and social changes challenged people, science and technology rose to prominence in powerful ways. In the fight against disease, humanity was stepping into one of the most significant turning points in history. Discovering that microbes could be controlled and deadly infections could be prevented was no longer just a dream. It had become an achievable goal. The year 1928 is etched in the annals of medicine. Alexander Fleming, by chance in his laboratory, discovered a type of mold that led to the invention of penicillin. This discovery revolutionized the treatment of bacterial infections. Previously, pneumonia, lung infections, and wound infections were often fatal, but now there was a weapon that could save lives when used properly. Penicillin was not merely a drug. It was one of humanity's greatest victories over microbes. The frightening face of epidemics and infections could now be managed through science and medicine. Yet it was not only antibiotics. Vaccines were also among the greatest miracles of the 20th century. Polio, especially during the 1940s and 1950s, left millions of children paralyzed or dead. The disease caused not only physical suffering, but also a societal crisis. People, fearing for their children, kept them away from parks and schools, and public gatherings were nearly banned. Jonas Salk's inactivated polio vaccine, developed in 1955, became the key to controlling the disease. Later, Albert Sabin's oral vaccine helped spread immunization campaigns on a global scale. Polio transformed from an individual fear into a controllable threat through international cooperation. The establishment of the World Health Organization in 1948 was a concrete sign of the global health struggle. Epidemics were now seen not just as national but as international threats, requiring coordinated responses, who not only monitored diseases but also protected millions of lives through vaccination campaigns, educational programs, and public health initiatives. When the organization led the eradication campaign against smallpox, humanity achieved an unparalleled success. Smallpox, which had haunted mankind for thousands of years, was completely eliminated by the late 20th century, a tangible proof of science and international collaboration. However, this process was shaped not only by scientific achievements, but also by social change and ethical debates. In some regions, vaccines were not rapidly accepted due to public resistance, misinformation, or lack of trust. People held both admiration and skepticism toward modern medicine. Vaccination campaigns became not only medical procedures, but also processes of social awareness, education, and trust building. From the mid-20th century onward, antibiotics and vaccines controlled the spread of deadly diseases, but the struggle continued. Tuberculosis, malaria, influenza, and other illnesses were monitored, prevented, and treated with new methods. Epidemics were no longer the result of fate. They became processes that could be guided by human intelligence, observation, and science. Laboratories, clinics, and hospitals became the new fortresses in the fight against disease. During this period, humanity began to view diseases not only as individual problems, but also as social, economic, and political phenomena. Epidemics clearly demonstrated the importance of public health, international cooperation, and scientific research. Antibiotics and vaccines did more than save lives. They gave humanity confidence in the future and the capacity to withstand crises. The health struggle of the 20th century became the history of humanity's victories over invisible enemies through science. Epidemics, once sources of death and loss, became manageable problems through collective intelligence, cooperation, and scientific knowledge. Penicillin, the polio vaccine, and the eradication of smallpox are among the brightest achievements in human history, symbolizing both the value of life and the power of science. The lessons learned in this era serve as a guiding light in combating 21st century pandemics. The early 1980s marked a period when humanity encountered a new and formidable unknown. Centuries of experience in combating epidemics and major advances in medicine, antibiotics, vaccines, and modern public health systems had already saved countless lives. Yet HIV/AIDS was different from any outbreak seen before. This invisible enemy threatened not only the body, but also societies, cultures, and humanity's perception of itself. When the first cases were identified, even scientists struggled to understand what they were facing. HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, targets the immune system, gradually leaving the body defenseless. Once it progresses to AIDS, death became almost inevitable. The disease started subtly and advanced rapidly. Persistent fatigue, weight loss, heightened susceptibility to infections, and rare cancers signaled that the virus was silently overtaking the body. People had to reconsider their daily lives, thinking not only their own health, but also the safety of loved ones. HIV/AIDS was not merely a biological crisis. It carried profound social and cultural consequences. Early on, the epidemic appeared concentrated in certain groups: homosexual men, drug users, and hemophiliacs. This led to deep stigma and prejudice. Misunderstandings about transmission fueled fear and anger toward people living with HIV. Media coverage often sensationalized and distorted the situation, exacerbating panic. The epidemic became more than a medical problem. It evolved into a human rights, ethical, and social justice issue. Scientists and doctors worked tirelessly to understand the virus's structure and develop treatments. In the early years, the virus's cause, transmission methods, and effects on the immune system were unknown, complicating both treatment and prevention strategies. Through research, laboratory experiments, and clinical studies, scientists uncovered HIV's RNA structure, its mechanism for attacking the immune system, and how it spreads. This knowledge accelerated drug development and helped educate the public. In 1987, the first antiretroviral drug, AZT, was approved to slow disease progression. This marked the beginning of a transformation. HIV was no longer an inevitably fatal disease, but a long-term manageable condition. Later, combination therapies dramatically extended life expectancy and improved quality of life. Yet access to these drugs was unequal. People in low-income countries often lack sufficient treatment, highlighting stark global health inequalities. International responses went beyond the virus's biological effects. The United Nations, the World Health Organization, and civil society organizations launched educational campaigns, awareness projects, and prevention programs. Measures such as condom use, hygiene practices, and safe injection protocols were crucial both to reduce transmission and to combat stigma. Activist groups pressured politicians and health authorities, advocating for both treatment access and the end of discrimination. HIV/AIDS brought a new dimension to humanity's fight against epidemics. It was not only a microbiological battle, but also a matter of ethics, rights, and social consciousness. People had to consider both their personal health and the broader justice of society in the face of an invisible enemy. This process demonstrated the power of medicine and science to save lives, while teaching societies how to confront fear, stigma, and prejudice. By the last quarter of the 20th century, HIV/AIDS had left humanity with both scientific and social lessons. Without knowledge, observation, and international collaboration, epidemics are not merely biological threats, but also social crises, human rights violations, and ethical challenges. Yet through science, education, and solidarity, it became possible to resist the invisible enemy. The history of HIV/AIDS is a powerful reminder that humanity must respond to epidemics not only with treatment, but also with awareness, empathy, and justice. As the 21st century began, humanity was living in a very different world. International travel had accelerated, trade and communication knew no borders, and cities were becoming increasingly crowded. Yet the advantages of globalization also created new opportunities for invisible enemies. Viruses and bacteria no longer threatened just a village, city, or country. They could spread across the globe in mere hours, with people traveling between continents. Epidemics have become not only biological events, but also economic, political, and social crises. In 2002, SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, emerged in Guangdong province, China, serving as one of the first major warnings of this new era. Initially affecting only a few patients, the virus quickly became a global threat. Airplanes, trains, and ships carried it to distant regions, such as Hong Kong, Canada, and Singapore. The disease manifested with high fever, cough, and respiratory difficulties, and in some cases proved fatal. SARS demonstrated how quickly health systems could be overwhelmed and underscored the importance of international collaboration. Quarantine measures, isolation of patients, and sharing of information played critical roles in limiting the spread. Between 2003 and 2004, MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, another coronavirus with a high fatality rate, emerged. First detected in Saudi Arabia, MERS spread through close contact and posed significant risks, particularly to healthcare workers and hospitals. This outbreak highlighted the importance of strict infection control in medical facilities and emphasized the need to monitor zoonotic diseases, viruses transmitted from animals to humans. The 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic once again exposed the risks of globalization and modern life. Originating in Mexico, the virus spread rapidly worldwide. Children, the elderly, and immunocompromised individuals were most vulnerable, but the rapid transmission underscored the critical role of global preparedness and early warning systems. Governments responded with public health measures, quarantines, school closures, and mass communication campaigns, emphasizing the importance of modern epidemiology and data collection. In 2014, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa presented a uniquely challenging crisis, both biologically and socially. The virus caused a highly lethal disease and spread quickly through contact with infected individuals and corpses. Weak infrastructure in countries such as Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea hindered containment efforts. Ebola was not merely a medical emergency. It was a complex social crisis involving public trust, traditional burial practices, and conflicting social behaviors. International aid organizations, the WHO, and governments intervened with education, isolation, and treatment centers. Ebola highlighted the necessity of global cooperation, crisis management, and cultural sensitivity. These examples illustrate that in the age of globalization, epidemics are no longer merely biological phenomena. Viruses affect not only bodies, but also economies, politics, social psychology, and international relations. Modern air travel and trade networks facilitate the rapid spread of infectious diseases. Therefore, early detection, rapid isolation, and international coordination are vital. Laboratories, medical centers, and governments must work in synchrony, and early warning systems must operate effectively on a global scale. New threats in the globalized era tested humanity's healthcare systems, scientific infrastructure, and social solidarity. Epidemics are no longer just measured by death tolls. They are tests of global preparedness, information sharing, and societal trust. SARS, MERS, H1N1, and Ebola left crucial lessons for both people and institutions. The speed of viruses can be balanced by technology and international collaboration, but societies must also be educated, aware, and ready for crises. The 21st century's epidemics symbolize humanity's ongoing struggle against invisible enemies. While speed, mobility, and globalization increase risks, science, technology, and international cooperation remain the keys to managing them. Humanity has confronted the reality that a local outbreak can become a global crisis and has learned the power of scientific knowledge and coordination in combating these threats. Each epidemic serves both as a warning and a lesson, leaving humanity with responsibility and hope for the future. At the end of 2019, a new coronavirus emerged in the city of Wuhan, China, and quickly set off alarms around the world. This virus, named SARS-CoV-2, appeared on the stage of history as an enemy that spread rapidly and caused severe respiratory illnesses. At first, people struggled to understand this invisible threat. Laboratories tried to track the virus, and scientists had not yet clarified the methods for treatment and protection. COVID-19 created a shock that went beyond the biological crisis, shaking societies, economies, and psychology alike. As the virus's transmission speed combined with the interconnected nature of the modern world, cities quickly became epicenters of the outbreak. People had to retreat into their homes. Streets emptied, schools closed, and workplaces moved into digital spaces. Social life almost came to a halt, and face-to-face communication was replaced by screens. Every breath carried risk. People hesitated to approach one another, and even feared embracing their loved ones. Healthcare systems faced an enormous test. Hospitals became overwhelmed, and intensive care units and ventilators gained critical importance. Doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers worked with extraordinary effort. Many risked exposure to the virus in order to save lives. The pandemic also exposed inequalities in healthcare infrastructure. Developed countries had access to better equipment and resources, while low-income countries struggled to cope. The pandemic left its mark not only on health, but also on the economy and politics. Lockdown disrupted supply chains. Small businesses went bankrupt and unemployment rates soared. Governments took extraordinary measures to protect citizens and maintain economic stability. The near standstill of social life deeply affected both individual mental health and collective societal morale. People felt the heavy burden of loss, uncertainty, and isolation. Scientists launched a rapid race to understand the nature of the virus, its transmission, and its mutations. Diagnostic tests were developed. Contact tracing methods were implemented, and international data sharing saved lives. The vaccine development process, in particular, occurred at an unprecedented speed and level of cooperation in medical history. Modern biotechnology, mRNA vaccines, and traditional platforms came together to protect billions of people. Vaccines played a critical role not only in individual protection, but also in achieving community immunity and controlling the pandemic. However, misinformation and disinformation became one of the pandemic's most insidious enemies. False information spreading across social media and various platforms created confusion regarding vaccine hesitancy and treatment methods. People struggled to access scientific knowledge and make informed decisions. This process highlighted that modern society must confront not only biological threats, but also crises of information and trust. COVID-19 also revealed inequalities and injustices. Different income groups, age groups, and regions were affected in diverse ways. Access to health care, working conditions, and social security became decisive factors in fighting the virus. The pandemic demonstrated how well societies could strengthen solidarity in times of crisis and the capacity of governments to protect their populations. Art, culture, and memory also played an important role during the pandemic. Diaries, social media posts, photographs, and personal accounts documented the individual and collective impact of COVID-19. These records became both a warning and a learning source for future generations. COVID-19 went down in history as one of the most comprehensive health tests humanity has faced on a global scale. Biologically and socially, it tested human resilience, trust in science, and capacity for cooperation, while exposing humanity's vulnerability to an invisible enemy. The pandemic also proved the power of modern science, technology, and international collaboration. Lockdowns, masks, quarantine measures, and vaccines served not only for survival, but also as lessons of preparing for future outbreaks. COVID-19, as one of the most challenging and instructive trials in human history, left lasting effects on health, society, and global cooperation. Pandemics have shaped human history not only through numbers and statistics, but also by leaving deep imprints on culture, art, and collective memory. The shadow of death and loss was always experienced as a tragedy, yet also revealed human creativity and the spirit of solidarity. Every epidemic became not just a biological crisis, but a force that shaped individuals' emotions, society's collective consciousness, and cultural expressions. During the 14th century, when the Black Death ravaged Europe, people's approach to art changed dramatically. Funerary ceremonies, motifs of death, dancing skeletons, and dark paintings reminded people of the inevitability of death while allowing them to confront fear. The paintings, writings, and architecture of this era reflected the social psychology of the pandemic. Through art, people mourned what they had lost and sought to give meaning to death. In more modern times, the pattern remained similar. During the 1918 Spanish flu, people were left helpless against the virus's silent and rapid spread. Diaries, letters, and memoirs documented the fear and loss of that era. People experienced not only the physical effects of illness, but also the psychological burden of social isolation, mourning, and uncertainty. Photograph, newspapers, and literary works emerged as tools shaping collective memory. The pandemic left traces in the collective consciousness, becoming a warning and lesson for future generations. The cultural expression of loss was not limited to art alone. Commemorative rituals, gravestones, and special ceremonies in temples and churches ensured that pandemics were etched into social memory. People did not merely bury their loved ones. They created symbols to remember them, express their mistakes, fears, and love. Epidemics force societies both to share the weight of loss and to strengthen solidarity. When a pandemic struck a village or city, people mourned together, prayed together, and tried to rise again collectively. In the present day, the COVID-19 pandemic has added a new dimension to art and memory. Digital diaries, social media posts, photographs, short films, and illustrations have documented humanity's losses and emotional experiences. Days spent in quarantine, masks, empty streets, and the dedication of healthcare workers were immortalized in visual and written narratives. These records have served not only historians but also psychologists, sociologists, and artists as a way to understand human experience. The pandemic nurtured creative expression, transforming pain into aesthetic language and demonstrating how humans cope with trauma. Loss and commemorative rituals also strengthen social bonds. During pandemics, people deeply felt the importance of support, solidarity, and empathy. Social memory did not merely preserve the tragedy. It carried lessons and warnings for the future. The influence of epidemics on art, literature, and culture revealed humanity's mechanisms for confronting death, uncertainty, and loss. Every epidemic exposed both human fragility and resilience. Death and loss were inevitable, yet human creativity, cultural memory, and social solidarity allowed these losses to be processed meaningfully. Art and commemoration were used not only to remember the past, but also to leave hope, lessons, and preparation for the future. The traces left by epidemics reshaped humanity's perception of itself and society, teaching ways to confront death and cherish life. In short, pandemics affected not only bodies but also cultures, social memory, and the human creative spirit. Every loss was preserved as a memory and a lesson. Every commemorative ritual created a conscious connection between humanity's past, present, and future. Throughout history, Pandemics have been both destructive and instructive, and losses have revealed the deepest and most meaningful layers of human experience. Pandemics have shaped human history not only as a biological reality, but also as a determinant of politics and economics. A virus, bacterium, or invisible pathogen can affect cities, countries, and continents without respecting borders, yet their impact extends far beyond health. Epidemics test government decision-making mechanisms, shake or strengthen leaders' popularity, and profoundly disrupt economic structures. As history has shown, crises reveal the fragility of political systems, while also exposing societal inequalities. During the Middle Ages, when the Black Death swept through Europe, labor forces were dramatically reduced, farmlands lay fallow, guilds collapsed, and urban production came to a halt. The feudal system faced a severe test. Peasants found opportunities to increase the value of their labor, and the bargaining power of the working class rose. Epidemics, therefore, had a shattering impact not only on health, but also on economic and social structures. This example demonstrates how crises can transform existing authority structures. In modern times, pandemics have highlighted the vulnerabilities of the global economy. During the 2009 H1N1 outbreak and the 2014 Ebola crisis, epidemics not only affected local workforces, but also disrupted global supply chains, slowed international trade, and pushed certain sectors to the brink of collapse. The COVID-19 pandemic took this impact to the extreme. The global economy suffered a deep crisis due to lockdowns, travel bans, and production disruptions. Small businesses closed, unemployment soared, and some sectors came to a standstill for months. The pandemic revealed the fragility of economic systems in the face of such crises. From a political perspective, epidemics test leaders and state mechanisms. Decisions taken during a crisis can either bolster public trust or erode it. Pandemics can also accelerate processes of authoritarianism or democratization. While some governments implemented strict measures to protect public health, others used these measures as tools for political control. Crisis management, transparent communication, and science-based policies determined a state's resilience. During COVID-19, some countries successfully controlled viral spread through rapid and effective measures, whereas others faced high mortality rates and social unrest due to delayed or misguided decisions. Epidemics also expose inequalities. Access to health care, income level, occupation, and age were decisive factors in individuals' ability to defend against a virus. For instance, healthcare workers and essential service providers were at the highest risk during the pandemic. Simultaneously, low-income groups often could not work from home or socially isolate. The economic consequences of the pandemic deepened social divides. Epidemics revealed not only a health crisis, but also a crisis of social justice and equality. Crisis management and economic support mechanisms became other critical factors determining government performance. Through economic packages, unemployment benefits, support for small businesses, and social protection measures, governments aimed to strengthen both individual and societal resilience. However, in resource-limited settings, these efforts proved insufficient, and income inequality widened in some countries. The pandemic tested not only healthcare systems, but also the holistic functioning of social and economic structures. The effects of epidemics were long-lasting. Changes in the workforce, disruptions in production systems, shifts in consumer behavior, and state interventions transformed economic structures permanently. Politically, crises tested leaders' credibility. Transparency, science-based decision-making, and communication with the public became vital to maintaining societal stability. Pandemics measure society's resilience not only to disease, but also to economic and political shocks. In conclusion, pandemics are not merely health threats. They are harbingers of political, economic, and societal crises. Each crisis reveals both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of governments and societies. Epidemics expose not only mortality, but also inequalities, injustices, economic fragility, and political weaknesses. History reminds us once again, humanity is tested not only physically, but also socially. economically, and politically, and these tests leave lessons for the future. Humanity has been tested by pandemics throughout history, sometimes quietly, sometimes suddenly, sometimes through prolonged crises. But each pandemic is not only a catastrophe, it is also a warning, a lesson reminding us how fragile our connection with nature is, the limits of human activity, and the importance of our resilience as a society. In the late 21st century, this lesson now stands before us as an undeniable reality. The future is ruthless for the unprepared. Yet conscious and cooperative societies can stay one step ahead of invisible enemies. Zoonoses, diseases transmitted from animals to humans, lie at the heart of this warning. Pathogens such as coronaviruses, Ebola, and H5N1 avian influenza are consequences of disrupted natural balances and humanity's close contact with ecosystems. While humans interact with animals, viruses evolve, creating new threats. Agriculture, urbanization, deforestation, and global trade have accelerated this process. At this critical point, the One Health approach becomes essential, a holistic understanding that human, animal, and environmental health are inseparable. This approach is key to preparing for future pandemics, because a disease does not affect just one species. It impacts the entire ecosystem and society. Early warning systems are among the most powerful tools offered by modern technology and scientific knowledge. Through laboratories, digital data analysis, and artificial intelligence, it is now possible to monitor and predict the spread of infectious diseases. These systems ensure rapid response when pandemic begins, timely implementation of quarantine measures, and the proper allocation of health resources. However, this technology must be applied globally, not only in resource-rich countries, so that all humanity is protected. A virus recognizes no borders. A vulnerable population threatens the world. Ethical considerations are also critical for the future. Fair distribution of vaccines, equitable access to treatment, management of health system resources, and prioritization during crises are societal responsibilities, not just medical ones. Decisions made during a pandemic shape not only the present but also future generations. No matter how advanced science and technology become, societies cannot ensure sustainable protection and security without ethical principles. Global challenges such as climate change, migration, and habitat loss also increase pandemic risks. Rising temperatures, changing ecosystems, and human pressure on nature create conditions for diseases to spread to new regions and for new pathogens to emerge. Humanity must manage not only current pandemics, but also prepare for future scenarios. This requires science, policy, ethics, and culture to come together in a unified strategy. The lessons of the future are clear. Establish early warning systems, strengthen scientific research and technological infrastructure, adopt the One Health approach, balance human-animal environment interactions, distribute health resources fairly, and ensure societal solidarity during crises. Every individual, community, and state must understand their responsibilities. Even small negligence can lead to global catastrophes. History delivers its strongest message here. Pandemics are teachers of not only the past, but also the future. They reveal humanity's fragility, as well as its resilience. Every virus, every pandemic, is a test. We learn, prepare, and grow more connected. The more humble humanity is toward nature, the better it can manage future crises. Looking at the history of pandemics from past to present, we see that these invisible enemies have left more than death and loss. They have left wisdom, solidarity, and ethical awareness. The greatest legacy for future generations will not merely be survival, but the construction of conscious, prepared, and just societies. Humanity will remember, again and again, that against invisible enemies, our wisdom, cooperation, and ethical stance are our strongest weapons. And perhaps the human spirit that rises after each crisis will be our greatest victory. For through losses, memorials, and lessons, we find a light to illuminate both the shadows of the past and the future. Good night.